and another director was assigned named Richard Thorpe. Richard Thorpe was known for all of the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan pictures. And Thorpe was selected because as the budget for The Wizard of Oz grew and they realized this was going to be in the neighborhood of $3 million, Thorpe was known for being very, very efficient. Like Alfred Hitchcock, he came to the set with the shots for the day already mapped out in his head, and he always came in with his pictures under budget. So he would do one or two takes and then keep moving. Well, after the first couple of weeks, the producer, Mervyn LeRoy, took a look at the raw footage and was really dissatisfied with what he was seeing, and he made the decision that Thorpe needed to be removed from the picture. After Thorpe, they were really scrambling, and they brought in George Cukor. And Cukor made a significant number of revisions to what he was seeing. They really started out trying to emulate Walt Disney's cartoons, and so the whole thing looked like a live-action cartoon. Cukor made some revisions, most famously removing Judy Garland's blonde wig and making her look more natural. And Cukor was not intended to helm the production long-term. He was preparing to direct Gone with the Wind. And after Cukor left, they brought in Victor Fleming, who directed most of the picture. But there were a couple of other directors that worked on it as well.
Going back to what you said about the Disney aspects or the Disney relationship to this film, you've referenced Snow White several times in the book as an influencer, or that somehow MGM was quite impressed with the success of Snow White. It sort of took off in 1938 and was a huge success, and it was fantasy. Was that a big influence for them?
It became the template for them. Not just an influence, it became a template with respect to story development, with respect to pacing, with respect to insertion of musical numbers. And Snow White really initiated a cycle of film fantasies at that time into the early 1940s. But it became so strong an influence that at one point during the script development phase, the producer, Mervyn LeRoy, actually requested a print of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs directly from Walt Disney, with whom he was very close friends, and he screened it for his entire unit one night out at MGM just to re-familiarize everyone with the flavor and the tone that he was looking for. And there were a number of similarities to Snow White that were in the film originally, that if they had stayed in the film, it would have really been embarrassingly similar.
Well, certainly one of those similarities has to be Gail Sondergaard's casting as sort of a more beautiful evil witch than the great Margaret Hamilton we see in the final film.
Right. So a lot of fans of the film are already knowledgeable that Gail Sondergaard was originally approached to play the Wicked Witch of the West. Sondergaard had worked with Mervyn LeRoy when he was out at Warner Brothers, and LeRoy cast her and a couple of other people who had been in his huge smash hit Anthony Adverse. So Gail Sondergaard already had a reputation of playing very duplicitous, very femme fatale type of roles prior to The Wizard of Oz. So if that's the route you were going to go and emulate Walt Disney, it made a lot of sense to cast Gail Sondergaard in that part. And for the first time in print, we published a costume and makeup test of Gail Sondergaard, looking very similar to the evil queen in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. She's got this cowl covering her head and a gorgeous black sequined witch's hat and cape with black sequins on the shoulders and very glamorous makeup and long lashes. And there was no change.org back then, but people were still responding to what they were reading about in the press, and they would address Mervyn LeRoy directly at the studio. And there was apparently such an early backlash early on about why are you doing that to the Wizard of Oz that they made the decision to revert back to the old and ugly witch that's in the original story. And Gail Sondergaard was a great beauty at that time and was a bit vain, and decided she did not want to be an ugly witch, and Mervyn LeRoy agreed with her. And so they brought on Margaret Hamilton, as you noted, who was really known as something of a comedienne at that time. Playing a villain, as she did in The Wizard of Oz, was really a bit of a departure for her. But she pulled it off masterfully, and she even says some of Gail Sondergaard's lines that were originally written for Gail Sondergaard. For example, when she's melting and she says, "Who would have thought a good little girl like you could have destroyed my beautiful wickedness?" That was a line written for Gail Sondergaard.
Interesting.
But of course, Margaret Hamilton made it her own.
Absolutely. So much interesting information in this book that really gives us a great background. I think anybody interested in the movie is going to want to read this book. And I was expecting a book maybe with a lot of photos as a photo book. This really has a great deal of text and a great deal of information for anybody who's interested in this story.
Exactly. Well, we've done the photo books. We've done the coffee table books. We've done several of those. And we had so much information that we wanted to do something that was a little bit more academic in approach, and also to explore all of the incarnations and iterations of the Wizard of Oz and the various Oz stories prior to the film that everyone is so familiar with, to show how bits and pieces of those prior incarnations influenced the film. And that's all in there as well.
Now, when The Wizard of Oz is released in August of 1939, it draws huge crowds. I know it had a big premiere in New York. Lots and lots of people saw it. Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland appeared in a stage show, and I guess at one point Burt Lahr as well.
And Bolger. Yes. Mm-hmm.
But the film ended up not making money. Is that right at that point?
Correct. Only because a couple of factors. At that time, the highest ticket price to get in to see a film was a quarter.
Okay.
So ticket prices were usually, a dime, 15 cents, 20 cents, but the highest ticket price would have been a quarter. Most of the patrons of films at that time, if it wasn't a weeknight, were children. So at any showing of The Wizard of Oz, at least half of the audience would have been made up of children who would have gotten in at reduced prices. So that curtailed MGM earning back its $3 million. They also put, $250 into advertising, $250,000, into advertising. Also, at the time The Wizard of Oz was released, it coincided with the outbreak of World War II in Europe in September of 1939. And so what was already starting to happen is that relationships with foreign film exhibitors were becoming very tenuous, and then ultimately got cut off altogether for the duration of the war. And so that cut off the opportunity to recoup additional funds through showings in foreign countries.
And that certainly makes sense, and I'm sure it would have done far better had it been available in those countries.
Absolutely. Boy, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was a worldwide sensation, and I think it made, we stated in the book definitively, but I think it made a minimum of $6 million in worldwide grosses, and that was in 1938 dollars.
What a phenomenon. Now, let's talk about the awards. The Wizard of Oz, unfortunately for it, was released during the same year as Gone with the Wind and a lot of other great films. And I would have thought The Wizard of Oz would have just swept the awards. I mean, it was an extraordinary achievement. It won, a couple of awards. It won, Judy Garland got a Special Juvenile Award, and it got Best Musical Score and Best Song. Is that right?
Correct, yes. Best Song for, of course, Over the Rainbow. Yes.
And what prevented it from getting special effects or costumes? I mean, those were extraordinary.
Right. Well, The Wizard of Oz was what was then called a prestige picture. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was Hollywood's biggest and finest film production studio. And every year, they would pour a lavish expense into the creation of a film that wasn't really expected to earn back its budget because it was so expensive. And so prior films that would have been prestige pictures were The Good Earth and Marie Antoinette, The Great Ziegfeld, and for the 1938-39, it was The Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz was also quite a departure in that there really hadn't been anything done like it and done successfully for about 4 or 5 years prior. And so it was this lavish spectacle laden with technical wizardry and extraordinary makeups and all sorts of strange anomalies and so on. But it was really something more of a curiosity than a serious contender for Best Picture. In those days, only dramas or romantic comedies were serious contenders for Best Picture winners, but it was nominated for Best Picture.
And you write in the book about this sort of comeback, and I found it interesting that one of the columnists would write, "Please bring back The Wizard of Oz," and it seemed like this was going on and on when people would make their choices for movies that should be re-released, since we had no television yet and all of that. So you had to go to the theater to see a movie. If you wanted to see an older movie, you had to go to a theater and see it again. And The Wizard of Oz took a while to get re-released.
It did take a while to get re-released. There was a public campaign that began with several Hollywood film columnists in the press in the early 1940s. So The Wizard of Oz was on a 3-year release schedule. So by roughly 1942, it had wrapped up all of its show dates. And almost immediately, there began to be a call for it to be re-released. And maybe that had something to do with people wanting something of a diversion from the worries over World War II and family members overseas and so on. But it would take a decade for it to finally be re-released in 1949, and it became a huge smash hit all over again. And that is when it fully recouped its budget and then some, and went into the black. In 1949, it was also introduced to a whole new generation. As you just said, there was no television really to speak of, at least not that people had universally. And so the only way to get your news and information, to see a cartoon, and to be entertained was to go out to the movies.
And certainly this led to a radio adaptation with Judy Garland reprising her role as Dorothy in Christmas, 1950. And then The Wizard of Oz comes on television in the mid-50s and becomes this phenomenon. Tell me about the phenomenon of The Wizard of Oz in television.
Well, what could be better than gathering together with family and or grandma or grandpa and being able to, be in your pajamas and have a, bowl of popcorn or some hot cocoa and watch this film that has stood the test of time. And as I said earlier, first aired in November of 1956 and then aired again in 1959, and then thereafter became an annual event. And